Matthew Siegel here, and as you will see, he is here in Winnipeg in a double role. So tonight he will talk about psychedelics and philosophy, and tomorrow at the Institute for Philosophy in our Philosophical Fridays series, he will talk about Whitehead and process ontology as opposed to substance ontology. I met Matthew for the first time when I spent some time at the Institute for Philosophy in Berkeley, and I was checking out the CIIS because they had a lot of interesting research going on regarding creativity and other things. And so I got acquainted with his work. He has a really interesting website called Footnotes to Plato, and also a really great email distribution system. So if you subscribe, you get...
Never get rid of me. Yeah.
Say what?
You'll never get rid of me if you subscribe.
Really interesting conversations with world-class physicists and so on and so on. So you're really at the forefront of contemporary research. So tonight, as you'll see, he will be talking on psychedelics and philosophy. And I hope to see lots of you also tomorrow. Welcome.
Thanks, Simone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm really enjoying my first or second night in Winnipeg, first time here. So just let me tell you a little bit about myself and my research first, and why I'm even interested in psychedelics as a philosopher. I think of myself as a transdisciplinary researcher, which is more than just interdisciplinary work, where I'm in my discipline and I like to talk to other people in their disciplines and we see what we can create between us. But I really try to inhabit a space between the disciplines, and I think of philosophy as itself being an interdiscipline, in the sense that, at least for me personally, I much prefer to talk to scientists, to talk to artists, to talk to activists, and to talk to other philosophers, because we're kind of boring. We're just doing our little philosophy thing. And one of the things that I like to research is consciousness. And when I was a teenager reading about the 1960s and the countercultural revolution and the way that psychedelics played a role in expanding people's minds, as it said, I got very interested in them from a metaphysical point of view. What is it that these substances do to us, you might say to our brains, but also to our consciousness, such that we rethink the whole relationship between the mind and the brain? And what role might they play in the transformation of society and culture at large? Right? And so I think of psychedelics, as we'll see, as a kind of research instrument for the study of consciousness. Biologists have their microscopes, and physicists have their telescopes, and philosophers or consciousness researchers have their own kind of instrumentation, namely these psychedelic substances or catalysts, agents of transformation, consciousness transformation. So, I'll tell you a little bit about the ground we'll cover tonight, but I first want to invite you all to share. I don't want to incriminate anyone, so I'll phrase it this way. Who here knows somebody, maybe including yourself, who has tried a psychedelic before? Okay. Almost all of you. That's not surprising. We're in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance. How many of you have read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind?
I've seen the Netflix.
Seen the Netflix? Yeah, the Netflix counts too. Great. So hopefully I'll have something new to share with you. But I wasn't at all surprised to see how many of you have either heard of somebody else trying them or have yourself dabbled. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of psychedelics from a Western point of view. I mean, people all over the world, on every continent that has been inhabited by human beings for thousands of years, have been engaging in the use of psychoactive substances. I'm going to start with natural history. You'll see why, and then get to cultural history. I'll talk a little bit about what's called the psychedelic renaissance, some of the medical and mental health research, and the evidence of belief change and increased well-being as a result of some of the trials that have been done on psilocybin, MDMA, LSD. and the relationship between that sense of increased well-being as a result of these experiences and what's called a mystical type psychedelic experience, which is a definition that's derived from some survey instruments after people have the experience. Many times people will have what's called a mystical experience, as defined by this survey scale. And we'll talk about the relationship between that and these positive mental health outcomes. And then we'll deal with some criticisms of the way in which mysticism is being used in a scientific medical context. Some scientists who are a little more secular and not comfortable with spirituality have some issues with that. And then I'll respond to those criticisms. All right. So first, some natural history. Before we get to the human history, it's important to note the evolutionary and indeed co-evolutionary context of these substances. So the question to ask here is, why do plants and fungi produce chemicals that mimic endogenous neurochemicals in our mammalian brains? Why should there be that relationship? Why should a little bit of psilocybin from a psilocybin mushroom produce such a profound experience in our brains? Why are these molecules hanging out in mushrooms that don't seem to do anything for the mushrooms that we can find, but that do a lot for not only humans, but any animal, any mammal that ingests them? So this is the history of life on Earth. Goes back about 4 billion years. About 400 million years ago, insects evolved and began co-evolving with plants. There weren't yet flowers until much more recent, after the dinosaurs went extinct, but there were plants. And these earlier forms of insects were interacting with plants, and plants were producing what are called secondary metabolites. And this is all written about in this wonderful book, Plants and the Human Brain by David O. Kennedy. Plants were interacting with insects and producing what are called secondary metabolites, which are not the primary metabolites used in their own metabolism. They're used instead to signal certain things to their environment, or they might be used to keep pests away. And so what we call the psychedelic molecules are considered secondary metabolites. These include things like terpenes. Anyone who's frequented a cannabis store will know what terpenes are. These are mildly psychoactive, and other alkaloids like psilocybin or DMT. And these have ecological functions, right? They allow species of plants to communicate with one another and to communicate with insects and other larger animals. The peyote mushroom evolved about 35 million years ago. The psilocybe genus of mushrooms, magic mushrooms, evolved more like 20 million years ago. These are estimates. But the interesting thing here is that these co-evolutionary relationships between insects and plants led to the emergence of a very important amino acid precursor called L-tryptophan. And L-tryptophan is important for synthesizing serotonin, which is an important part of the nervous systems of insects and all animals. And as Kennedy says, the ecological functions of secondary metabolites, and in particular the role that these chemicals play in the close relationship between insects and plants, underlies many of the psychotropic effects of these phytochemicals within the human central nervous system. So, in other words, our own brains and the chemistry of our brains are derived from the relationships established over millions of years by insects and plants. And I like to think of the implication here that really the human nervous system is not just contained within the skull. Because of these co-evolutionary relationships, I think somebody's trying to get in.
Trying to get in here, oh, sure.
They really want to get in. So our nervous system is not just contained within the skull, right? The idea here would be that our brain, in effect, extends out into the surrounding ecosystem, and even back into the depths of time. And so usually we think of consciousness as an emergent product of the neurons in our brains, but if you consider these coevolutionary relationships, I think we can say consciousness is emergent from the entire ecosystem within which we are a part, right? Because we're constantly exchanging molecules every time we eat something. And certainly when we ingest a psychedelic mushroom, the reason we get high is because of the relationships established by insects millions of years ago. So that's the natural history. Let's shift over now into human history, cultural history. Not that humans aren't part of nature, but it's clear that our hominin ancestors have been Our hominin ancestors have been ingesting psilocybin mushrooms, certainly, and other psychedelics for millions of years. But hard evidence for exactly how these mushrooms would have affected our cultural life is hard to come by. We have these cave paintings, which clearly show some kind of a shamanic type of psychedelic experience, probably with mushrooms in this case. This is from a cave in Algeria, and it's estimated to be about 10 to 12,000 years old. Another cave drawing down there that appears to show some little mushroom men running around. So clearly, psilocybin mushrooms have been used thousands of years. We have evidence of that, hard evidence, in Egypt, Siberia, Spain, Greece, China, Australia, the Americas. Some have speculated that religion itself and spirituality itself emerges in this early period as a result of psychedelic experiences. Some religious scholars are very upset by that idea. Certain religious leaders are very upset by that idea, but there's some evidence to suggest that there is a connection there. I'll return to that in a minute. But we need to be careful here, as one scholar, historian of drugs and an ecologist named Andy Letcher, puts it in his book Shroom, A Cultural History of the Magic Mushroom. He says that the tendency to imagine drugs at the center of a variety of ancient religions says rather more about us and our inability to countenance religious ecstasy without the use of psychoactives than it does about the religions concerned. So in other words, human consciousness has metamorphosed over time, and our contemporary, disenchanted, more or less rational, kind of individualistic and materialistic mode of consciousness is a rather recent invention. And just because it's hard for us to imagine seeing or hearing gods or the animate spirits of the natural world without drugs doesn't mean that primal indigenous people were not capable of doing so. So we can be cautious, we should be cautious about this hypothesis about religion originating in psychedelic experiences. Maybe not. So now the colonial history. The Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez arrived in present-day Mexico in 1519, intent on conquering the Aztec Empire. Many of you probably know this story. He had a few hundred men, he had some cannons and guns, but his most powerful weapon was actually microscopic, and it was a secret even to himself. He didn't know that he and his men were carrying smallpox, this European old world disease that was totally new to the immune systems of people in the Americas. And smallpox decimated the local indigenous population, including the Aztec Empire at the time. And it's only for this reason that the vastly outnumbered Spanish were able to colonize the region. There were reports from various Spanish chroniclers, like Diego Duran, who was a Dominican friar, about the use of psilocybin mushrooms by the Aztecs. The Aztec ruler at the time that Cortez arrived, Moctezuma II, is said to have employed a group of mushroom-munching priests to help him decide when to go to battle, to make predictions and divinations and prophecies. about his battles, but there are also reports of recreational use. So these things weren't just used in ceremonial and religious and political contexts. They were used for fun, even back then. Another a Franciscan friar, also Spanish, this guy, Bernardino de Sahagún, in his text, The Universal History of the Things of New Spain, drew some pictures of these mushroom ceremonies, which the Aztecs called mushrooms Tionanacatl, which means flesh of the gods. And I'll read how he described the use of these substances. He says, "These are intoxicating and cause visions to be seen and even provoke sensuousness. They ate these mushrooms before dawn, and they also drank chocolate before daylight. They ate these little mushrooms with honey, and when they began to be excited by them, they began to dance, some singing, others weeping. When the intoxication from the little mushrooms had passed, they talked over among themselves the visions which they had seen." So as colonization progressed, these ancient Mesoamerican mushroom practices were largely eradicated. The Catholic Church was not such a fan, and a few lineages survived, but in the remote mountain regions, and were later rediscovered. This is a researcher from Harvard named Richard Evans Schultes, who in 1938, he came from Harvard and joined some European researchers who were already in Mexico, and he was attempting to identify this mushroom that these Spanish friars hundreds of years earlier had written about. You know, scientists, researchers, anthropologists were not sure if they were real or not, and so there was a lot of investigation, and Schultes actually initially wrongly identified the species of mushroom, not as one of the Psilocybe genus, and it was only discovered 20 years later, so in the 50s, that it was actually psilocybin mushrooms. But Schultes nonetheless wrote, "Because the mushroom is regarded as being semi-sacred, it is difficult to purchase specimens. They are usually presented as a gift. There are among the Mazatecs professional divinators who earn a livelihood by endeavoring through mushroom intoxication to locate stolen property, discover secrets, and give advice." Many, many uses here beyond just the sacred. So the next important historical moment is when this guy, Gordon Wasson, who was a journalist turned banking executive, and his wife Valeria, they read about Schultes' discovery, and they wanted to travel down to Central America to learn more about these mushrooms. Wasson believed that all human religion originated in a mushroom cult, right? So he was a very strong believer in this hypothesis that the origin of religion is associated with psychedelic experiences. So in the summer of 1955, he met Maria Sabina, and under her guidance, that's this woman here, he tried psilocybin for the first time. Probably the first Westerner in a very long time, although psilocybin mushrooms grow in Europe and across North America, and so we don't have records of their use, and I think during the medieval and early colonial period, the people doing mushrooms in Europe probably wouldn't want to advertise the fact because the church was burning people at the stake for much more minor offenses than that. So Wasson has this experience, and he famously publishes his findings in Life magazine. This was in 1957. It's the editors of that magazine that coined the term magic mushrooms for the first time. Shortly thereafter, Wasson sent samples to a mycologist in Europe, Roger Heim. He's the one who identified the genus as the psilocybe genus, correcting Schultes' incorrect identification. And then Albert Hofmann, who you may have heard of as the first to synthesize LSD. He's working for this company in Switzerland called Sandoz. Based on the sample of the psilocybe mushroom, he was able to extract the active ingredients of psilocybin and psilocine, closely related molecules, and he created an artificial form of this, which he named indocybin, with the prefix, I guess, meaning Indian, which reiterates Columbus's mistake that he had arrived in the West Indies and called the people Indians. And so throughout this whole episode, we can see the way that colonialism continued in another form, the effects of colonization continue in another form. Wasson was obviously seeking some academic fame and some degree of celebrity, which is why he went to Life magazine. He probably didn't intend to disrupt Maria Sabina's life or to disrupt the Mazatec people's lives, but when this Life magazine article came out, thousands of God-seeking, trip-seeking hippies would travel to Mexico and really destabilize the region. Other locals in Maria Sabina's village got very upset with her, burned her house down, she was ostracized. It wasn't a good thing. But this launched the 1960s psychedelic revolution. Wasson's article in Life magazine inspired a Harvard psychology professor you also may have heard of, Tim Leary. And he was very interested to learn more. He actually traveled down to Mexico to try them, but then he realized he could just ask the Sandoz company, Albert Hofmann's company, for this indocybin pill. So he didn't need to, go find these mushrooms. And as a result of his experiences and the experiences that his colleague, Dr. Richard Alpert, and their graduate student, Ralph Metzner, had on psilocybin, they started what's called the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Here they are. That's Leary in the middle, Richard Alpert on the left, and Ralph Metzner on the right. Interestingly, Metzner would later become the dean of my university, CIIS, where he did administrative work and taught for 30 years, roughly, and died several years ago. They conducted many experiments as part of this Harvard psychedelic project of questionable scientific validity. One of the experiments that this project included was the so-called Mars Chapel or Good Friday experiment in 1962. This was led by this man, Walter Pankey, who was a graduate student, both in divinity in the divinity school at Harvard and a medical student in the medical school at Harvard. And basically he had two groups, a control group that was given nicotinic acid, which basically makes your skin feel kind of hot. And so it's an active placebo. They were told it was not active, so they wouldn't expect to feel anything if they got the placebo. So it was active so that they might think, oh, maybe I did get the psychedelic. The other group got psilocybin. One of the members of that group was the famous religious scholar Houston Smith. And so it's Good Friday. They're in Marsh Chapel. Robert Thurman is upstairs giving a sermon, and they're downstairs, and his sermon is being piped to them through the speakers. And within about 20 to 30 minutes, it became very clear to the control group that they did not have psilocybin, because the people on the other side were just having this ecstatic experience, saying, I see God, and, having full-blown mystical experiences. Now, the results of this experiment were quite impressive, but the design was flawed. And in his dissertation, when he was writing about this, Pankey didn't mention a little problem which occurred, which is that one of the divinity students who did get psilocybin ended up leaving the chapel because he was under the assumption that he was the Messiah, and he really needed to go inform the dean of this. And they actually ended up having to sedate him, right? This didn't get put into the printed dissertation, wasn't mentioned, and only was discovered much later. The founder of MAPS, Rick Doblin, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, did a follow-up study where he interviewed the people in both groups who were still living using the same survey scale, and found that the effects and the impact on them after the experience was still maintained many years later. So the people that did have the psilocybin did report that the experience was just as profound and that it continued to give them a sense of well-being for the rest of their lives. So by 1963, both Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert would be fired from Harvard. So the 60s are really getting going now. They were giving psilocybin and then LSD to all of their graduate students, to anyone, artists, intellectuals who would take it. And Harvard began to realize that they weren't doing science anymore. They were becoming religious proselytizers, basically. So it wasn't long after that, before the end of the 60s, that Richard Alpert would return from India as the spiritual teacher Ram Dass. And Timothy Leary, of course, became a bit of a cult, had a cult following and was quite a personality. Spent some time in prison, broke out of prison, traveled around the world, landed back in prison. He developed his own form of psychedelic spirituality, and he, of course, was the messiah of that psychedelic religion. Ralph Metzner, on the other hand, as I mentioned, was perhaps the sanest of the bunch and ended up at CIS continuing a more or less normal academic career, though he did continue to write and publish and research psychedelics. And if any of you know Ram Dass, I think he's quite a legitimate spiritual teacher, actually, and you might find his work to be great value. So I don't mean to be dismissive of him. Timothy Leary is a more controversial figure. So this brings us to the present, and as I mentioned at the start, we're in what's being called psychedelic renaissance. And this began, I would say, around 2006. And in the last 15, almost 20 years now, research into psychedelics has exploded. It's harder and harder to keep up. It's not just the psychologists who are interested, it's the philosophers as well. Chris Letheby's book, Philosophy of Psychedelics, came out a few years ago. We'll talk more about that. Philosophy and Psychedelics is an interesting text. I have a chapter in there. And so everybody wants a piece of the pie here. But of course, what got it all started was this paper in 2006 out of Johns Hopkins University. Roland Griffiths, Bill Richards, McCann, Jesse, they published this paper, Psilocybin Can Occasion Mystical Type Experiences Having Substantial and Sustained Personal Meaning and Spiritual Significance. So this got it all started. Immediately upon the publication of it, dozens of news outlets announced the findings. And Johns Hopkins became the center of this new research program. They're continuing to do wonderful research. Griffiths has since died. There are wonderful researchers there like David Yaden, who I'll talk about in a minute, who's continuing to carry forward that work. Now, this whole question of measuring mystical experience is a tricky one. So most of these studies are still using a mystical states scale developed by a researcher named Ralph Hood, who I've met. He's quite old now, but still kicking. And Hood had originally derived the basic ingredients for this mysticism scale from a book by Walter Stacey, who in turn had drawn from William James, who in 1902 had published a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he was studying mystical experiences. So there were some early theoretical criticisms of this mysticism scale, but it's proven to be quite reliable across cultures, and it's now increasingly well regarded among psychologists of religion for the way that it characterizes mysticism. And so the way that it works is about 7 hours after you ingest psilocybin in a safe clinical setting with usually 2 guides. About 7 hours afterwards, the effects have mostly worn off, but you're still in this kind of afterglow state. You're given this survey, and it's asking you about how intense your feelings of awe and joy and peace and love were, whether you experienced a sense of merging with ultimate reality, whether you experienced a kind of universal life in all things, a sense of transcending normal space and time, ineffability or paradoxicality, or other things that are asked about, and importantly, a noetic sense, which means that you have the direct experience of this altered form of reality being more true and real than your normal experience, right? That's the noetic quality. And so if you score highly enough in all these different categories, it's considered to be a complete mystical experience. And about 22 of the 36 total participants in this 2006 study reported, according to this mysticism survey, that they had a complete mystical experience. Additionally, they gave questionnaires 2 months after the psilocybin experience, and there were persisting effects, positive effects related to attitude, mood, behavior. And in these follow-up surveys, 67% of participants rated their experience with psilocybin to be either the single most or among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives. And they also reported elevated mood, positive attitude, and altruistic social effects. And all these findings were also confirmed by designated community observers of them. So this wasn't just the participants saying they felt better and were more compassionate. Also, a designated observer affirmed that. And they also noticed this connection that the stronger the mystical experience, the more likely that participant was to have this sense of perceived well-being afterwards. Very exciting stuff. So more recently, there's been a bit of a setback for the medicalization of these things in the U.S. The FDA recently decided not to approve MDMA for PTSD. MAPS and its benefit corporation, Lykos, had gotten to the stage 3 studies, meaning hundreds of participants had taken MDMA. The results seemed very positive, but the FDA had some issues, including the issue of what's called expectancy, which is that a lot of the participants in that study already had tried MDMA before, or they had a lot of knowledge about what to expect from the experience, and so the FDA was worried that that front-loaded it too much and they didn't build into the study any way of differentiating between the effect of expectancy that you would have a positive experience from just the effect of the substance itself. Might seem like a minor issue. They also had problems with the lack of the ability to really have a blinding, so that you would have a control group that didn't know whether it got MDMA and another group that did get MDMA. But the thing with psychedelics is it's very easy to tell when you've gotten the real thing versus the placebo, and so it's unclear what the FDA expects researchers to do about that problem. But as this recent Rolling Stone headline says, people are trying magic mushrooms for depression and accidentally meeting God. The medicalization movement is faltering. Maybe that's because psychedelics have been spiritual tools all along. This is a recent New York Times article, The Unlikely Force Behind a Push to Legalize Shrooms in New York. There is a psychology professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Benny Shannon, who has argued that ancient Israelites may have come across hallucinogenic plants as they wandered to the desert ahead of Moses' revelation. Many rabbis are very upset about that, but he thinks there's good evidence for it. This is an article about the psychedelic churches that are cropping up in the U.S. Many of them are are petitioning the DEA to give them permission under a religious exemption to use these substances. There's a big church in San Francisco called the Church of Ambrosia that operates taking donations in exchange for mushrooms that they grow on site. San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, all the major cities in the Bay Area where I come from have decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms and other plant-based psychedelics. And so the medical movement is going to continue to push forward, but there's also this other side of the psychedelic renaissance, which concerns the spiritual and religious uses of them.
So can you just remind us what FDA, DEA?
Oh, sorry.
stand for?
Yeah. FDA is the Federal Drug Administration, and the DEA is the Drug Enforcement Administration. So the DEA busts the drug dealers, and the FDA allows the corporate drug dealers to market their drugs. So this is Merlin Sheldrake. Maybe some of you have read his book Entangled Life, perhaps? Anyone? Oh, I highly recommend it. Okay, one person. He's holding his book. It's been colonized by mushrooms, as you can see. And in that book, he describes his own participation in an LSD trial, a study that was done in Britain. And he sort of makes fun of the idea that one could, in a survey, answer from 1 to 5, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your loss of your usual identity? How would you rate your experience of pure being? But nonetheless, we can learn something from these surveys, even if it's a little bit absurd to quantify these sorts of things. And he also, in this book, explores a kind of thought experiment about the impact of psychedelic mushrooms on human evolution, imagining, what if these mushrooms have some kind of agency in this process and are trying to propagate themselves by getting humans very interested in the experiences that they can produce. This is another friend of mine, Bruce Damer. He's a computer scientist and astrobiologist who studies the origin of life. He has started a new movement a new center called the Center for Minds, which stands for Multidisciplinary Investigation into Novel Discoveries and Solutions. And so the idea here, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that psychedelics, in addition to having mental health applications and perhaps spiritual and religious implications, can also be thought of as instruments for scientific and philosophical research. And this Center for Minds is going to be encouraging scientists who have really difficult problems to solve to consider a psychedelic experience, to bring some insight, some new perspective to what they're struggling with. So as I see it, these are basically the three avenues that psychedelics are opening up, right? Research instruments, mental health applications, and spirituality. And, the religious groups, the psychedelic churches, are arguing for kind of religious freedom exemption from the drug war laws that started in the U.S. with Richard Nixon, and as a result of some of the rabble-rousing that Tim Leary and others were engaged in, it all got shut down. Research stopped, which is why we needed the Renaissance, in 2006. So there's the religious freedom argument. There's also, I would say, a cognitive liberty argument, which is that as individuals, we have the right to, as long as we're not hurting others, to alter our consciousness as we see fit. Especially when the substances we're using to alter our consciousness are much safer than alcohol and tobacco, and many pharmaceutical drugs which are legal. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to overdose on psilocybin or LSD. MDMA is a little bit more toxic, but still, there are so many drugs that our society accepts as fit for use, whether it's tobacco or alcohol, caffeine. How many of you had coffee today? Come on, look at you. Yeah, that's a hardcore drug, And so there are cultural reasons why some drugs are okay and others are not. And I think part of what I hope to see as the so-called psychedelic renaissance continues is that politicians take note and we can begin to stop imprisoning people for this. So let's talk about the research on belief change. There's another questionnaire, another instrument called the Metaphysical Beliefs Questionnaire that Chris Timmerman and his team, I think he was at Imperial College in London when he did this research. They've developed this to try to determine how people's beliefs change before psychedelic experiences and before their first and after their first psychedelic experience. And so things like ontological transcendentalism, as they called it, there exists another separate realm or dimension beyond this physical world that can be experienced or visited. That very high number, close to 1, means that many people after their first psychedelic experience thought that that was a credible idea. Similarly, visiting immersive realms or worlds can sometimes depend on supernatural or magical transition processes, right? So the idea that there's more going on in this world than just material cause and effect. People who've done psychedelics tend to think so. Interestingly, dualism, people who have a psychedelic experience begin to consider consciousness as something separate from the brain. And then you see these negative responses. Negative 0.7, there is just one primary reality, the physical. The mind and our consciousness is just physical functional properties of the brain and has an entirely material explanation. After their first psychedelic experience, people were way less likely to believe that. Some more research on belief change. Psychedelics occasion changes in metaphysical beliefs away from materialism. So similar results, people are less likely to be materialistic. Views like panpsychism, which is the idea that you see also represented over here, that psyche or mind or consciousness is present not just in human beings, not just in animals, but also in plants, insects, even rocks. Really, that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental particles that physicists say would compose the universe. That would be the full-blown panpsychist view. And as you can see, after psychedelics, people are far more likely to take that seriously. Also idealism. And so there's a strong move away, as a result of taking psychedelics, from a materialistic worldview. And interestingly, these shifts towards panpsychism or idealism are also correlated with improvements in perceived psychological well-being. So panpsychism, idealism seem to be, I'm just reporting the data, better for your health, and materialism, not so much. Finally, this is a study that Roland Griffiths did several years ago. He surveyed people who had experienced either naturally occurring or psychedelically occasioned encounters with God or ultimate reality. And he wanted to track the shifts in belief before and after this experience. So it's both a group of people that didn't do drugs and a group of people that did do drugs, psychedelics, and had this encounter with God or ultimate reality. And you can see that, for example, more than 2/3 of those identifying as atheist prior to either type of experience no longer did so afterwards, with the effect being especially pronounced for those whose mystical state was induced by psychedelics. Their survey respondents also reported strong, persisting positive changes in their attitudes towards life as a result of experiencing God or ultimate reality. So that's what the data suggests. Now, of course, there are some critics. So while multiple studies have shown that psychedelics, either a single experience or lifetime use of psychedelics, induce notable lasting shifts away from materialism and atheism toward idealism and panpsychism. In addition, these shifts from materialism come with increases in perceived well-being. But the question is, are these changes in belief scientifically justified? Now, here's what the people at Johns Hopkins say. While psychedelics may provide some individuals with some insights into profound seeming features of their own consciousness, this does not mean that these insights necessarily play a role in identifying scientific ground truth beyond that of introspective insights in general. The insights that people have under the influence of psychedelics may be false, and they cite Chris Letheby, whose book I mentioned earlier. Although the relative frequencies of true and false insights that people tend to have under these conditions remain an open question. All right, so further research is needed. Now, these guys are more skeptical. This is Sanders and Zillmans. The current blend of mysticism and science and psychedelic research risks damaging the credibility and potential of psychedelic science. A theoretical shift is needed to clarify the division between psychedelic science and supernatural or non-empirical belief systems. Perspective frameworks should be unambiguously secular, and alternative questionnaires need to be explored or developed so as not to only predict outcomes, but indeed measure the experience of interest. So they don't like the mysticism scale because they think it's priming people to interpret their experience in religious terms, and they think science should be unambiguously secular. And so they're worried about the way that psychedelic researchers have tended to pollute the science with spirituality or religion, but none of these studies were imposing a particular religious belief, but they were kind of creating an environment which would be more or less spiritual. So like in these rooms, the clinical rooms where they would ingest psilocybin, there would be maybe a Buddha statue, and they'd be playing choral music that would be traditionally played in a religious context. And so, the trappings are there, even if they're not imposing a specific belief system. So I would say, and I have argued, that modern secularism and scientific materialism are not metaphysically neutral. There's no neutral ground here. The idea that secularity is somehow without any beliefs associated with it, that it's just sort of, we just look at the empirical evidence and have we're not front-loading our experience with any type of beliefs. Well, there's no such thing as neutrality when it comes to metaphysics. We all have a metaphysics, right? So that makes this question a little bit more difficult. So while the majority of practicing neuroscientists do favor a materialist ontology, for example, they would say consciousness is some kind of illusion that is causally reducible to brain activity, that is a paradigmatic assumption rather than an empirical finding. There's no way to empirically prove that the brain produces consciousness. Everything we know scientifically about the relationship between consciousness and the brain is a correlation. And so metaphysically or philosophically speaking, we could argue that the brain is more like a radio receiver, and consciousness is a kind of non-local field that the brain tunes into. So that obviously if you have brain damage, if you get into a car accident and hit your head, you're going to affect the receiver's ability to get a clear signal, right? And so there are other interpretations of the neuroscientific data than just the idea that the brain is a producer of consciousness, right? The science can't decide that question for us. It's a philosophical question. I think there are basically four options for philosophically interpreting the place of consciousness in the natural world. There's materialism, dualism, idealism, and panpsychism. Materialism is the view I just explained, that the brain produces consciousness through some kind of a mechanism that we haven't figured out yet, but we will eventually. Dualism would be, again, the idea that there's just mental stuff and material stuff, and they just exist in two entirely different worlds. It's not quite clear how they relate, but they're irreducible one to the other. Idealism would be the view that everything exists in mind, and matter is a kind of appearance, kind of illusion. Bodies are a kind of illusion. And panpsychism is a more moderate position. Bodies are real, organisms are real, but consciousness or experience would be pervasive in the sense that there is no organized material form, whether you're talking about an atom or you're talking about a cell or an animal or a human being, that isn't there for itself. Or when there isn't something it is like to be that entity, right? That would be the panpsychist view. So it's not saying everything is in mind and matter is an illusion. It's saying every material body that is self-organizing has a mind. So these four views, I think, are, more or less defensible metaphysical interpretations of the available scientific evidence. And we cannot decide among them on empirical scientific grounds alone. Additional criteria are needed, and I say some of them might be normative. And what I mean by that is, as this data has shown, after a psychedelic experience, the intensity of one's mystical experience and the shift away from materialism and atheism towards panpsychism or idealism comes with increased sense of well-being. And so if people are mentally healthier as a result of these non-materialistic beliefs, then maybe we ought to consider them just pragmatically, even if we don't know if they're true or not. We feel better believing they are. Now, from a scientific point of view, that's not a legitimate reason to take them seriously, but philosophers have really tried to address these concerns in a variety of ways. Owen Flanagan has argued that clinical researchers need to avoid pathologizing widespread beliefs, even if they're unscientific, because really, especially in a medical context, we're trying to help people live flourishing lives. So Flanagan writes, I quote, certain trends in psychiatry, secular scientific culture, and philosophy pull for norms of being in touch with reality as it is that would, if abided, impoverish human life. So he says that, instead of trying in mental health context to enforce a kind of materialistic conception of what is accurate and true, we need to consider the possibility that there are positive illusions, right? Now, personally, I would say there's no reason to say idealism or panpsychism are necessarily illusions, but even if you do think materialism is true, psychologically speaking, we might not want to push that on people too hard because we'll all be very sad. So there is a downside to psychedelics, however. Oh, I think I have one more line here. Right. So there is a downside here. Right? Psychedelics show great promise as belief-transforming spiritual technologies, but there are bad trips. There are really difficult experiences that people can have, and indeed, Roland Griffiths and many of the other researchers have written about those who have negative experiences. This is Rachel Peterson, published here. She's now a researcher at Harvard University's Center for the Study of World Religions, which is doing a lot of work on religion and psychedelics right now. Charles Stang is the director of that. And she was actually a participant in Roland Griffiths' study at Johns Hopkins in 2018 on psilocybin for people with major depression. And as her experience points out, and I'll quote her in a second here, these experiences do not mask our emotional pain. They're not escape routes from the things we struggle with and existential suffering. We have to face hard truths about ourselves often in these experiences. And these can be intensely difficult experiences of self-confrontation, even in the best, most well-controlled and compassionate environments. In one of Griffith's earlier studies in 2011 on psilocybin, he reported that while more than a third of participants experienced extreme levels of fear and paranoia at some point during their session that these psychological struggles did not affect the overall rate of having a complete mystical experience, as rated on this mysticism scale at the end of the day. So even though they had at least part of their trip which was bad and involved all these negative experiences, when they're through it on the other side, the participants tended to interpret this as meaningful and generative of insights, and they were able to integrate it, right? So this is what Peterson says about her experience. The many things that I experienced over those first 6 hours really defy retelling. Among them, I became one with nature, only to become one with its ongoing decimation. And I wept with a depth of grief and guilt unknown in my waking life. Wild with pain, I asked nothing in particular. What is there after this? And my experience broke open into an abiding force that permeated existence. Something, rather an ultimate nothing that felt infinite and furiously important. A nothing that seemed to somehow exist before the trip began. It felt like it endured long after the trip ended. You can find her speaking about her experience on YouTube. I encourage you to listen. She has a lot more insight to share. And so rather than merely being neuroscientific chemicals or psychotherapeutic tools to fix broken brains, Rachel Peterson came to understand psychedelics as what she calls ontological insurgents, or agitators that can facilitate direct experiential encounters with other forms of reality. But, she adds, perhaps to our horror, they also demand something of us. So the psychedelic experience might not fix you, but it will show you how you can fix yourself. Would be her view of it. This is Sarah Hoffman, another she calls herself a philosopher of drugs. This is a paper of hers, Positive Affect and Chris Letheby's Naturalization of Psychedelic Therapy. So we saw Letheby's book earlier, and this is a friendly critique. She agrees with much of his argument, but thinks he leaves out the role of affect and emotion as one of the important ingredients in leading to positive mental health outcomes. If you have positive affect during your experience, she would say you're more likely to have these prolonged feelings of well-being afterward, which somewhat, stands in some tension with what Rachel Peterson was just saying, that even negative affect can, if you integrate it, lead to positive outcomes. Nonetheless, affect is really important, and she thinks Letheby left that out. Now, Letheby's argument in his book Philosophy of Psychedelics is that the mechanism of action, as the psychiatrist would say, or the pharmacologist would say, that allows for, say, psilocybin or MDMA to lead to mental health benefits, is that we're able to, in Letheby's terms, perceive our own self-model, that usually our brain produces a model of the environment and a model of ourselves responding to that environment. And that model, that self-model that we have is usually transparent to us. We can't see ourselves. But under the influence of a psychedelic, he says, all of a sudden, this self-model becomes opaque, which is to say, we see the lens through which we normally see through, and can become more aware of how we get in our own way in life, and then adjust this self-model to get rid of negative beliefs and so on. Sarah Hoffman thinks that may be true, but it's a little bit too abstract. What's the role of emotion in our sense of the feeling of expansiveness and compassion? Hoffman argues that MDMA, for example, reduces the effects of PTSD because it tends to produce the release of oxytocin, which is very important for social relationships. It enhances our feelings of connection, feelings of compassion, including self-compassion, so that we can forgive ourselves. She says that the enhancement of feelings of sociability, trust, and communicative motivation may accelerate productive interpersonal and intrapersonal therapeutic work. She also critiques Letheby's argument which he explicitly says is more or less materialist and naturalistic. So he's trying to interpret mystical type psychedelic experiences in a totally naturalistic way, and he imagines that the brain is a kind of prediction machine, that our normal everyday consciousness is itself a kind of controlled hallucination already, even before we take any psychedelics, because the brain is producing guesses about what it's going to experience next, and through millions of years of evolution, the guesses that our brain makes and the sensory feedback it receives have adjusted such that our guesses are usually right. But nonetheless, the guesses are producing this hallucinatory experience of the world. It would be called a controlled hallucination because it's checked by our sensory perceptions. But nonetheless, what psychedelic experiences do is they take away that perceptual control, and the hallucination engine runs wild, as it were, producing all the characteristic visuals and intense experiences of psychedelics. And it allows us to adjust what the neuroscientists who developed this predictive processing model would call our priors. We adjust our expectations about the world and allow more of the perceptual field to flood in so that we can see the world afresh without front-loading it with all of our expectations and our habitual forms of cognition. But Hoffman points out that that's just one model of how the brain works, and it's a particularly materialistic model, and there might be other ways of interpreting that if we let go of materialism. So I'm going to close with one more slide here, which is a suggestion that maybe we can take spirituality seriously, and a question: what would a non-materialistic interpretation of these mystical type psychedelic experiences look like? What sort of shifts in our worldview might they bring about, particularly in the midst of an ecological crisis, where our economy is predicated upon the belief that the non-human world has no value outside of the context of the market? Maybe panpsychism would be an important part of the shift in our deep motivational structure so that we no longer treat the non-human world in that way. That might be one answer to that question about why, the sorts of spiritual views that psychedelics can produce in us should be taken seriously. And I'll end with this famous quote, maybe some of you have read it before, by William James, from The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is where this mysticism scale is derived from. He says that our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch, they are all there in all their completeness. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. So that's James, 1907, I believe. And if you want to follow up on any of the research I shared, you can find it there, and a couple of my publications there. Feel free to reach out, and we only have about 25 minutes for questions. So thanks for your attention.
Okay, so thank you, Matt. And just after we have questions, we also have snacks at the back. I hope you will take some. Those of you who are standing, feel free to grab a chair. There should be some chairs right behind you if you want them. We have some time for questions, and I will maybe just let you feel good.
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry, I came a bit late because of a problem getting inside, and I don't know what you know. So I may have missed this, but do you discuss Terence McKenna's approach to explaining the development of human consciousness as predicated on ancient herders? Following birds in the Sahara or whatever it was.
I didn't mention him by name, but this is actually a drawing by his wife, Kat. I'm very familiar with McKenna's work. I think it's wonderful. I sort of was in college raised by his lectures on some level, becoming he's one of the influences that got me into philosophy. And there's his stoned ape theory, which, yeah, I discussed. He's not the only one who suggested that, but he certainly popularized it. And I cautiously suggested that maybe that's how we became human. That's how we became spiritual because of these experiences. He even says that our capacity for language was a byproduct of ingesting psilocybin mushrooms.
Development of our brains.
Yeah.
Just a little adjunct. Why in that study was atheism contrasted or set up as the antinomy of panpsychism? I don't quite understand that pairing.
You mean this one?
It's atheism versus panpsychism. Where was that? There was a study.
This one.
Is it there?
Yep.
Well, there were grouped with three categories on the left and three on the right, and they were being contrasted with each other. Atheism was a third on the left, and panpsychism was a third on the right. So I'm assuming that. Sorry, I don't remember which slide it was.
Huh? I'm not sure.
Maybe you can speak to that.
Why would atheism be
Contrasted or
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't
held up to the
necessarily.
antinomy of panpsychism, or is that just?
If I had said that, I might have missed.
No, you didn't say that. It was just.
Oh, is there?
It was in a study.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't see that you could be a panpsychist and not be a
Exactly.
theist.
Okay.
You could be an atheist, panpsychist for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Here.
Well, I find it curious on that chart that there's such a low factor loading for idealism, because in your later chart you show a high correlation between idealism and psychedelics.
You mean this one?
No, idealism. 1, 2, 3, 4 down.
There is just one primary reality, the mind and our consciousness, and all material things derived from it. Yeah, it's moderately positive, but yeah, not very much. Yeah, it's a good question. There are different people being surveyed, and different experiences, and so this is ongoing research. There do seem to be some strong correlations, but we'll see as we do more studies how it shakes out.
Okay, well I got a ton of questions.
Yeah.
Okay. One thing that, I'm a palliative patient who's had psychedelic experience for end of life, and I had a mystical experience. There are medical professionals who are working with palliative patients like me, who are saying not all patients, like who are working under the legal framework that we have here in Canada that mandates 2.5 milligrams of pure extract or synthetic, and psilocybin. They're saying that some of these patients do not achieve a mystical experience, and I'm wondering whether this is a dosing issue, or do you have any insight onto that?
Yeah, I could have included another slide that showed Johns Hopkins has done some research on dosage and the likelihood of a complete mystical experience. And I forget the exact dosage number, but certainly higher than 2.5 milligrams increases the likelihood of a mystical experience.
And yet I saw Hoffman, it was 2 milligrams of his synthetic. That was interesting.
Yeah, you mean on the bottle?
Hoffman,
It suggested a 2 milligram dose.
It was 0.2 milligrams
Per
of
pill.
taking, and I'm assuming that he thought that was a megadose kind of dosage.
Yeah, I'm sure they were taking more than one pill. Yeah.
Where would I find that Johns Hopkins research? Is it recent? Would it be on your website?
Yeah, it would have been in the last couple of years. So if you just search JSTOR or something, it's a growing crickets study. It was one of the last studies he did before he died. So it's a couple of years ago. Here.
How do you explain the air quotes around the word God? First in relation to your own research, and then if you want to answer, you don't have to put and then in relation to your own experience.
Yeah. Well, when they ask that question in these surveys, did you experience or encounter God, they will often say God or ultimate reality, because God is a very charged word. Some people might be very spiritual, but want nothing to do with the idea of a personal deity. And so if they only put, did you experience God, someone of that sort of persuasion would be like, well, no. But if you put, did you experience ultimate reality, they'll say yes. And so that's one of the shortcomings and limitations of a survey like this is, you know, the experience itself, one of the questions they ask is it ineffable? And a survey full of words getting you to try to describe it, right? And so that's a dilemma. But they try to come up with a language that is not objectionable in the sense that it's inclusive of a whole variety of different spiritual outlooks, right? And they're continually refining these surveys. I mean, from my own personal experience, there are many gods that I do not believe in, and so often when I talk to an atheist, I say I'm probably an atheist, in relation to the gods you don't believe in, also. But I think in certain company, words mean different things to different people, and in a certain company, I might be comfortable using the word God. In other contexts, it might be misleading. Yeah.
Because, I guess the problem with people who research this kind of stuff is that they usually do it in a kind of secular atheist setting.
Yeah.
And so there are all these really charged words that they're as soon as you use them, everybody's beliefs just come rushing down on them, and then they start labeling things, and then that kind of blocks the communication and all those things. So I think a lot of the times it's exactly the intellectual circles that it's we're guilty of doing that a lot because we're so attached to some of these labels and definitions, and and this is why a lot of this pushback, right, that this research is facing.
Yeah.
It all has to do with this pride and authority that we really draw from our intellectual elitism and nothing else, right?
Yeah, I agree. I've encountered that and experienced that. Just to speak to what the more secular atheist researchers are concerned about, psychedelics increase suggestibility, which means that if you're in the wrong set and setting, they can function to, people can become indoctrinated into cults. There have been serial killers who used acid to get people to do horrible things. So there's a concern that if we're not cautious and we overly dress up our descriptions of these experiences, that we might be biasing how people interpret the experiences. And so I think maybe there's a happy medium somewhere where even secularly minded people can acknowledge the mental health benefits of an open, inclusive, spiritually pluralistic sort of outlook. Because it seems to me that these substances are, there's the psychedelic researcher and psychiatrist Stanislav Grof refers to them as non-specific amplifiers. Amplifiers of what? Of our set and setting, of our mindset and the immediate context within which we take the substance. And so we want people to have a good experience, and so we want them to be surrounded by beautiful art, maybe in a natural setting, which hasn't really happened in any of these studies because they're all stuck in a square room, usually with eye shades and artificial music being piped into their ears. Not the most ideal setting, but yeah.
Isn't that another problem with our expectation of psychedelic experience, that we're so biased against suffering and against negative experience?
Yeah.
But for a lot of the time, that's precisely what's necessary. When you talked about the downsides, right? For me, it was but that's the point.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about downsides of it, right? And you're protecting someone who has PTSD of getting a bad trip that can basically save his life, because we're so biased against, we just want to block, suffering, and that's how we just prolong this kind of constant harm of suffering that we're under, right?
Yeah.
and we never like get rid of it because we never process it. And the only way to process pain is to like really feel it, right? I mean,
I agree with you. It's a
So-
huge debate in the ethics of the medicalization of psychedelics. Huge debate. I mean, I could have spoken for an hour just on
Yeah.
that. But yeah, I'm glad there is that here. And then, yeah.
I heard that you're a friend of the professor, Dr. John Reiki. He talks a lot about like relevance realization and studying people's brains when they're undergoing what's called a pure, at least called the pure consciousness experience, where qualia disappears, and so the regular functions of consciousness like tracking and time just go to basically infinity because there's nothing for them to actually grab onto. Do you think that do you think that like when people are taking very large doses of say like psilocybin or something, is it mimicking what say like the meditation master who's done like 15 years or Dr. Reiki himself who does really extreme meditations, and he's gone into these states of pure consciousness experience he studied himself. Do you think the drugs are mimicking that process, or are they like shutting down and bringing back up the default mode network, or doing some other function that's causing a transformation experience that's different than what that would be?
Very controversial question. You know, when Johns Hopkins wanted to do a study on long-time meditators and see how brain scans would be different compared to the normal population when they're on psilocybin. And a lot of meditation teachers got very upset and said, you know, to their students, don't do that. That's fake. Those are fake experiences. You're doing the real thing. You know, others were perfectly willing to participate in the study. Personally, I think that there's reason to suspect that what psychedelics do to the brain is similar to what happens when someone has a spontaneous mystical experience, or when someone has cultivated through whatever kind of meditative technique to enter into that experience of emptiness. I think there are parallels there, but there's a difference between a state and a stage, say, of development where, you know, an experienced meditator can get into that state of consciousness in 10 or 15 minutes just by sitting on a cushion. But it could be that what they're doing through practice and intention is altering their brain chemistry in the same way that psilocybin would. You know, if you ate 2 or more milligrams of psilocybin. So I think there's parallels there, but you know, there's this term gate crashing that gets used by spiritual practitioners who they worry that when people do psychedelics and they have some big experience, full, you know, mystical awakening, that they didn't earn it, right? And they're just sort of being thrown into heaven without having to do any of the work to achieve and maintain that kind of a stage of consciousness. So it's a state you get to visit, but then you come back and it's like, well, how do you integrate that? This is what Rachel Peterson was talking about in terms of how they act. These experiences can ask something of us, right? And so I think you can get a glimpse on psychedelics, but then the question becomes, how do you integrate that? How do you change your life as a result of that?
Do you know the results of the comparison with the long-time meditators who did take place in the study? I heard about that study. I haven't seen the results of it myself.
Yeah, so I don't think they've published it yet. I've heard Rowan Griffiths gave the last talk while he was still alive at a big mass conference in Denver. He was discussing the study and said they'd be publishing it in a few months. He died several months later, and I don't know if it's been published yet. I don't think it has, actually. They're still working out the details, so maybe any day. Yeah, I'll be looking for that. Here?
Also, thank you very much for your talk. I found it very, very interesting. I have a maybe tedious philosophical question, so I'll try. So you mentioned that these persons who took these psychedelics after were more receptive to certain ontological theories, like say panpsychism or idealism, and then you also note that there was also this sort of increase in their perceived well-being. which would be a reason to maybe favor the theory. I think that sounds plausible to me. I guess I was going to ask, what do you feel about the concern that, so you might think that at some point people who were serfs or enslaved persons, etc., had certain beliefs that were very comforting to them. Say the belief that after this life they'll have this sort of life in heaven or something like that, that's far preferable. And then there's a reality beyond this like very horrible reality that they live in. And is there any cause for concern maybe that a person after their psychedelic experience could be in a similar position to say these people have these sort of comforting beliefs, and while they do have increased perceived well-being, maybe their lives are quite bad or something like that?
Yeah, I mean the whole socioeconomic context of our lives is such that, you know, someone suffering from major depression or PTSD or whatever could go have a really amazing experience and think, wow, I have a full view of life, and then they go right back into poverty or, you know, poverty or whatever. And that becomes actually a situation wherein they're not better off, because they can see how bad their situation is, you know, and they're not habituated to it in a way that they were. So, yeah, that's a problem. And again, like, these aren't miracle cures, and I think if they are psychedelic experiences to have a positive social effect, then that would include not just people having a new attitude, but actually transforming, you know, our economy and transforming the inequities in our society. And, you know, so there's a lot of work to be done after a wonderful experience. Definitely.
But I guess you could say that if you had this wonderful experience and we solve these other problems, double plus or something like that.
Plus, yeah.
And other people just have the plus or
Right.
something like that. So
Yeah.
you could say something like that.
Simone, yeah, I think we have time. We can get on these hands.
Yeah.
Sorry, maybe what a good thing to do would be, why don't we let everyone who has a question ask the question, and then you can sort of address them all, so that we squeeze them all in. Because we only have
So I make mine quite short. So I identified at least 3 different, one could say, interpretations by yourself on what's going on with this experience. On the one hand, you spoke about unspecific amplification of what you would experience anyhow. Then something like feeling better. So materialism makes you feel worse than panpsychism, for instance. So saying that the states, the philosophical convictions that you get or that get amplified through drugs make you feel better. Or you could say that's not really an argument for the validity, so to speak. And then the third approach would be to say, okay, drugs make me see into the normally hidden mysteries of reality that are normally filtered out by my consciousness, right? And the question is for me, which one of the 3 are you entertaining?
Okay. Yeah, it's
so
the third, but I'll come back to that. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to point out, like, I think one of the things when it comes to psychedelics for therapeutic use is it's not just the trip itself. I think there's this sense that, like, oh, you just take the mushrooms, you have this profound trip and you're healed. I think a really huge part of it is the intention you set before and the integration you do afterward.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's come up in your research as well. Or
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I can address that. I agree with you. Yeah.
I have a pretty short one. Have you had a mystical experience, and how did it influence your research? If yes or no.
Yes, and I'll come back to how.
I have a very different point though. So, just from the philosopher side and also the whole thing, it's a bit puzzling that people who take drugs and report an increase in their religious belief. It seems that the opposite has happened, in the sense that if I have a deep religious mystical experience and then I realize that other people take mushrooms and they have the exact same experience as me, it will make me feel the mind is less mystical and coming from the divine, but rather something very material because it can be replicated by mushrooms. I mean, it goes along the same sort of replication argument that we had before. So if you could sort of explain how. Sorry?
Are you speaking hypothetically?
Not hypothetically. I mean, it seems that the rational conclusion from some people take psychedelics and they have a mystical experience is to doubt that the mystical experience is much more than sound reaction to the.
It's a common.
Yeah, I mean,
Unless you believe your perception has changed, and so you perceive the world differently.
so I mean, and I'm sure they're genuinely
Yeah.
saying that they're having a mystical experience. There's no doubt about that.
That's right.
If you can say that about how that happened.
I'll try to wrestle with that.
Yeah.
Oh,
My
here.
comment kind of responds to that. I was going to say, well, I believe Ram Dass in his book Walking Each Other Home talks about Timothy Leary's death. And Timothy Leary, I believe, at the end of his life was a materialist. Ram Dass was an idealist. They both had really good deaths.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. There are mystical materialists who study. Some of them are
Mystical
neuroscientists
materialists.
who study psychedelics and don't accept any of the spiritual stuff, but they become mystical when they're out there.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
So, when talking about psychedelics, it seems like a big part of it has been this idea of understanding. That when you take psychedelics, you get a better understanding of the universe, understanding of your own spirituality, whatever it may be. But my question would be, would you be able to apply this in a non-spiritual context for understanding? So say in like a school context, if you need to, learn calculus, could you take psilocybin to then promote something in your brain or mind or however you think about it to then learn about that through triggering an understanding of the sort?
I never tried it for learning calculus. It might be less beneficial for a kind of analytical skill like that, but maybe more for the humanities majors. No, I mean scientists have had major breakthroughs. But if you're already an expert in something and you have a really hard problem you can't get your head around, I think a psychedelic might give you an alternative way, lateral thinking, a more creative approach that you hadn't considered. As far as using it to learn calculus, I don't think you're going to be very interested in calculus when you're but good question. I think there are applications for it.
Okay, so this will probably have to go awesome.
Yeah.
The research question that you had up there, the kind of the after report, you mentioned that it's kind of in a come down period off the high.
Yeah.
And that's kind of when the questions are asked. Do they ever conduct the same questionnaire, period of time after the psychedelic experience, and do we find that whether or not the changes, the opinions they have now are the same, or do they change over time? Do they tend to kind of, in the come down, have very mystical experience and then kind of return back to having more atheistic or materialistic views?
Good question. The simple answer is yes, they do follow-up studies 3 months and 6 months later. I think 6 months is as far as Johns Hopkins has done in its research, and the results remain the same. I mentioned Rick Doblin, who did a follow-up study of the Marsh Chapel experiment that was in '63. He followed up with people in the 80s who were part of that experiment, and their scores on the mysticism scale hadn't changed after a couple of decades. So their memory of the experience was still that yes, this was a profound.
So these are like permanent changes.
Seems to be. Simone, I do think that as research instruments in for philosophers or for scientists, that we can actually learn about reality. And I've written about that. If anyone, I can't go into detail right now. I don't have time, but in the second paper there on chemical consciousness after Descartes, Whitehead's philosophy of organism and psychedelic realism, I make the argument for that option.
Is it okay to take a photo of this?
Oh, sure, of course. In terms of preparation and integration, probably just as, if not more important, the experience itself, because your intention is going to shape it. And again, it's that question of getting a peek or a glimpse of something. You have to integrate that afterwards. Or it's just, it's like ecotourism or whatever. You're just sort of visiting a place and not really changing anything for the better. Now, you might have a better chance at having increased well-being afterwards, but to make that an enduring mood change and to really have it affect the world in a positive way takes work. Yeah. Thanks for that, John. I can't get to all the questions.
The personal stuff was interesting.
What's that?
The personal stuff is.
Love the personal stuff. I haven't had a mystical experience without drugs, but it was a very difficult. It wasn't totally without drugs. I had done too much drinking the night before. I was visiting Israel many years ago. I was at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Museum, really hungover, trying to be respectful and take in, the meaning of the place I was at. And they have a garden in the back and a children's memorial, and we kind of go underground, and it's dark, and there's this sound of children's names who were killed during the Holocaust being read, and in the dark there's like one or two candles reflected on mirrors, so it looks like they're going out infinite space around. And I just started wrestling with the problem of evil and like who's responsible for this, and I was like found myself shamanically merging with different Nazi soldiers and then Hitler himself, and trying to understand like how did you do this? Why did you do this? And it just became clear to me that they're just people. And I couldn't find anyone to blame. And was crying and couldn't look people in the face because I saw how infinitely unique each one of us is, and it was too overwhelming. So I looked down at the grass and I saw how infinitely unique each blade of grass is, and I was still overwhelmed. And powerful experience. I don't know exactly if a particular insight came out of that, other than this is a really amazing planet we get to
That
live on.
wasn't alcohol.
It was a hangover after that.
It was not alcohol.
I wasn't drinking that day. Maybe I should have had some alcohol. Well, thanks everyone.
Well, that's a
Great
beautiful note
questions.
to end on. Thank you for that. On your way out, for some snacks you can grab. I think the philosophy students were supposed to have a pub night tonight, which they generously canceled so that they could be here. And so, to reward them for their sacrifice, I think the intention is to go to the King's Head pub afterwards. So you are all invited to do that and to speak with our speaker further. I think
I'm coming.
Well, you're not going to drink enough. I hope that you'll end up with a spiritual experience tomorrow morning in Winnipeg, because I don't know what that would look like, but
Yeah, no blackout.
anyway.